Welcome to Develop Schedule process under Project Schedule Management. This is the last process under Planning Process Group under the Project Schedule Management. If you recap, under 6.2 Define Activities, we define activities taking into account the WBS work package and broke it down into decomposition mode or the rolling plan method to come up with activities. Subsequently, we define the sequence of activities depending on the predecessor and the successor relationships and lead and lag relationships. Next, we defined and estimated the activity durations using various techniques such as the PERT model, analogous estimation or parametric estimation. Now, at this moment of time, we have the activities defined, we know their sequences and their relationships, and we have the activity duration estimated. With all those information, now we are in a position to develop the project schedule. So as the other processes, this process also is depending on some inputs, and there are some tools and techniques that we can use to develop the schedule, and also there are various outputs that are coming out of this process. So let's look at the inputs. One of the key inputs for this process, develop schedule, is the schedule management plan, which defines the governance and the policies and the procedures and how we are going to manage schedule for this project. The scope baseline, the WBS and the WBS dictionary and the scope statement, and also the other project documents such as the activity attributes, the activity list, the assumption log, and the risk register will be inputs for this process. Also, any agreements with the customer, if you are handling a project for a customer, then any agreements with the customer on contractual commitments will be an input to develop the schedule, because it will give you the start time and the end commitment times or any other milestones that we have agreed with the customer. As environmental factors, we need to understand the government regulations, the industry standards, because in previous processes also we discussed this, how these inputs will be affecting the activities, the activity durations. Also, any policies governing the scheduling model that we had to use, whether we are going to use the critical path method or any other scheduling module, which we'll be discussing in a short while. Any other policies governing this need to be taken into account, which will be used in your organization. So one of the key tools that is used for developing the schedule is the critical path method. Let us try to understand what is critical path. A critical path is a path where the least amount of float and slack time is available. If you can remember, under sequence of activities process, we discuss and define what is a float and what is a slack time. So critical path we usually take as critical path where the float is 0, where there is minimum float or there is no float at all. Under critical path method, let's discuss this example. Under sequencing activities, we already discussed the notation of representing a network diagram. This notation, can you remember, where the early start time and the early finish time, the latest start duration, the latest finish time. is indicated, and the duration is indicated in this box, and the total float is indicated in this box. So with that revision, let's look at this network diagram. So from the start of the project, there is an activity A, and after activity A, there are two activities that can start parallelly, activity B and activity C. And activity D is waiting for the output of activity B and activity C to commence the activity D. In this example, please note that the example has been developed using calendar days. So, to understand the diagram, the activity A has a duration of 5 days, activity B has a duration of 5 days, activity C has a duration of 10 days, activity D has a duration of 15 days. So if the project starts from the day 1, activity A will consume 5 days, and including the day 1, it will supposed to end, the earliest finished day will be on day 5. Please note again, this example is based on calendar days. So then activity B is scheduled to start on the next day, on day 6, and activity B will has a duration of 5 days, and including the 6th day, calculating 5 days, the activity B will finish at early finish time of 10 days. Same goes here. Activity A finishes at the end of the 5th day. Activity C can commence on 6th day. Activity C needs 10 days to complete, and activity C will, at the earliest finish date, will be the day 15th, where the activity C will end. And if you take activity D, activity D waits for the output of activity B and activity C. So the activity B, the earliest finish date is day number 10. Activity C, the earliest finish date is day number 15. But the earliest start date for activity D, since it needs the output of C for the process of the D activity, the earliest start date is the day 16 and not day 10, because D has to wait until C finishes. So the earliest start date is day number 16. Activity D will have a duration of 15 days, and activity D will end on the 30th day. So this is the calculation method for the earliest start date and the earliest finish date. On the critical path method, we go on a backward calculation to find out the float. So the earliest finish date of the project is 30, then we can include it as the latest finish date here, and activity D needs 15 days to complete. So calculating backwards, activity D, the latest start date will be 16 days, and if you take activity C, since this is a calendar date example, the previous date will be activity, the latest finish date of activity C will be the 15th. It needs 10 days to complete activity C. Calculating backwards, the latest start date will be day number 6. Same goes here. Activity B, the latest finish date will be 15th, 5 days for the completion, and then the latest start date for activity B will be 11 days, the day number 11. If you take activity A, B and C depends on the output of activity A. So the latest start date of activity B is 11 days, and the latest start date for activity C is 6 days. In that way, since C is depending on A's output, and the latest start date the activity C can commence is the day number 6. Therefore, the latest finish date of activity A should be day number 5. So activity A must finish by day number 5 in order to C to begin its latest start date. The latest start date of B is 11, and even though activity A ends in day number 5, it can still wait until day number 11 to start activity B. If you can remember, under sequencing activities, we explained the float is calculated by reducing the difference between early start date and the late start date, or the difference between early finish date and the late finish date. Under that, the float is calculated with the difference between early start date and the late start date, early finish date and the late finish date. So in here, the float is 0 because 16 minus 16 is 0. The float is 5 days, 6 minus 11 is 5 days. The float is 0 again, 6 minus 6 is 0. And the float here is 0, 1 minus 1 is 0. So under this example, the critical path would be where the float is 0. In other words, A, C, D. The highlighted arrows will signifies the critical path of this project. Hope you understood that example. Let's take another example on the critical path method. Kindly look at this project. So there are two activities, A and E, commencing from the start. And activity B follows after A and E. Activity C follows after A. Activity D follows after B and C. Activity F follows after E. And these are the durations of the project, each and every activity. So keeping that in mind, let's try to draw the critical path. Let's try to draw the network diagram. So activity A and activity E commences from the start. Activity A and activity E commences from the start. Under the notation, the center box indicates duration of the activity, so 2 and 7 is there. And activity C follows A directly with a duration of 6 days. Activity C follows A directly, duration of 6 days. Activity B follows A and E for a duration of 4 days. Activity B follows A and E for 4 days. Activity F follows E and the duration is 2 days. Activity F follows E for 2 days. And activity D follows B and C for 3 days. Activity D follows B and C for 3 days. And the N signifies by activity D and F. So once F is completed and D is completed, an end is defined. So this is the network diagram. And now let's try to again fill in the boxes with the earliest start time and the earliest finish time. So in this method, in this example, we do not use the calendar method. In other words, once the activity ends at the day number 2, we assume that activity C also parallel starts at day number 2. In the previous example, we were using a calendar date method, but here it should have been day number 3. But in most of the examples and even in the PMP examination, we follow this unless specifically specified that it is a calendar date method that is being followed. We usually follow the general dating mechanism. So we start from day 0, 2 days for activity A. The earliest finish time will be 2 days. Activity C will start from the second day, 6 days for it, and the earliest finish time is 8 days. Activity E, starting from 0, it takes 7 days, earliest finish time is 7, and activity F, which is directly after activity E, the earliest start date is 7, 2 days to complete, and the earliest finish time is 9. Now let us look at activity B. In activity B, waits for the output of activity A and activity E. Activity E's earliest finish time is 7 days, and activity A's earliest finish time is 2 days, day number 2. However, activity B is dependent on the output of activity E. In that way, even though activity A finishes on day 2, the earliest start time the activity B can start is after day 7, because activity B is depending on the output of activity E. So therefore, the earliest start time the B can start is day number 7 and activity A, and not at activity A day number 2. Hope you got that. So activity B, the earliest start time is day number 7. The duration is 4 days, and then the earliest finish time is the day number 11. Same thinking pattern has to go for activity D. Activity D is depending on C and B output. Activity C is the earliest finish time is day number 8. Activity B's earliest finish time is day number 11. Since activity D is depending on B also and C, although C finishes on day number 8, the earliest start time the activity D can commence is day number 11. Activity D has 3 days duration, so activity D the earliest finish time will be day number 14. Since there is no activity at the end, in order for the calculation to get easy, we will substitute this end with a zero day activity milestone. So this is the end. So the earliest finish time is day number 14. Day number 14 is a zero milestone, and the earliest finish time will be day number 14. So on the reverse back calculation, activity D, the latest finish time will be day number 14. 3 days to complete for it. Calculating backwards, the latest start time will be day number 11. Same goes here. Activity C, the latest finish time will be day number 11, because activity D's latest finish time, the latest start time is day number 11. So the latest finish time for activity C is day number 11. The latest finish time for activity B will be day number 11, and duration 6 days. Calculating 11 minus 6 is 5. Calculating 11 minus 4 is 7. And here, straight away from the end, the latest finish time of activity F is 14 days. 2 days for duration. 14 minus 2 is 12. And in this one, in activity E, B and F is depending on the output of E. The latest start time of B is 7 days. The latest start time of F is 12 days. And since B and F is waiting for the output of E, and B's latest start time is 7 days, then the latest finish time of E should be 7 days, because B is waiting for E, and only if this completes by 7th day the B can start, and the latest start time would be 7. So the latest finish time of E would be day number 7. Same goes here. Latest finish start time of B is day number 7. Latest start time for activity C is day number 5. Since C and B is waiting for A's output, and A's latest finish time should be day number 5 in order to satisfy the latest start time of C, day number 5. So once 5 and 7 is in the box, 2 days for the duration, 5 minus 2 is 3, and 7 for the duration, 7 minus 7 is 0. So as explained earlier, the float is difference between earliest start time and the latest start time, earliest finish time or the latest finish time. So the float will be 2, float will be 3, here the float is 0, the float is 0, the float is 0, the float is 5, and here is the dummy. This is a dummy entry. So anyway, the critical path is where the float is 0, the path that the float is 0. So then the critical path will be E, B, D will be the critical path. Hope you got that example correct. Right. The other tool that can be used to develop a schedule is the PERT technique, the program evaluation and review technique. This we explained in detail in activities sequencing process. You could refer that video for more details. So under the PERT technique, we try to understand the risk component in estimating the duration. So if you as a project manager and have uncertainty in calculating the duration of an activity, so this is one of the techniques that can be used to calculate the duration of an activity, which will incorporate the risk factor. So here, as we explained previously, for each activity you can take the most optimistic time of the completion, the most probable time of completion, the normal time of completion, and the worst case scenario, the worst time of completion for each activity. And then you can calculate the beta distribution as the optimistic time plus 4 times of the normal time plus the pessimistic time divided by 6. So this will give you the beta distributed activity durations, which have incorporated the risk factors of completing each and every activity. So if you take this example, and let's try to draw as third example the network diagram. So A and B starts from the project. So A and B kickstarts from the project activities. Activity C follows A directly. Activity C follows A directly. Activity D follows A directly. Activity D follows A directly. Activity F follows D directly. Activity F follows D directly. Activity E follows B and C. Activity E follows B and C. And activity G follows E, and then it goes to an finish. So this is the network diagram, and as an exercise you can complete this, and these are the durations that you need to take in. So the duration for A is 4, duration for D is 6.33 days, duration of F is 4.5 days. F is 4.5 days, which is here. And likewise, you can put the duration and you can start calculating the earliest start time and the earliest finish time. And then you can start calculating the latest start time and the latest finish time. And you should arrive at these figures if a calculation is correct. So after that, the critical path is where the float is 0. The latest finish time and the earliest finish time, the difference, or whichever the other way around. So if you calculate the float is 0 in activity A, C, E, and G. Hence, the critical path is A, C, E, G, which is 19.51 working days. If we go back, it is A, C, E, G, A, C, E, G, which is 19.51 days of the latest finish time or the earliest finish time. So that is the critical path. Okay. The third method of developing a schedule is the critical chain method. In this method, is a scheduling method that allows the project team to place buffers on any project schedule path to account the limited resources and the project uncertainty. So in the critical chain method, unlike in the critical path method, project buffers are placed at the end of each activity path, and then after the critical path there can be a project buffer. So let's try to understand this in more detail. So here is a comparison between the critical path method and the critical chain method. In the critical path method, usually buffers are added up at the estimating stage at each activity. We learned earlier in estimating duration process where the contingency reserves are made. So under critical path planning method, contingency reserves are made for each and every activity. So there will be a contingency reserve for each and every activity of the project schedule. And also sometimes the critical path method fails to acknowledge the fact that there are some limited resources. And in this example, John has to perform in day 2 for a particular task. John has to perform the second task, and John has to perform the fourth task on parallelly. Sometimes this can overdraw John's resources. But in critical chain method, what we do is actually we include a feeding buffer and we try to release John so that John resource is free, so he can do the activity number 2 in the day number 2 and activity number 4 in day number 3, for example, so that there is no constraint on John. And so there will be a feeding buffer between activity number 3 and 4, and then at the end there will be a project buffer. Since under critical path method we include contingency reserves for each and every activity, there is a tendency that the due date, the final end date of the project is more pushed, whereas in critical chain method it is a more aggressive estimation, and since we use minimal buffers as a feeding buffer and project buffer, the due dates tend to come forward when you compare the both methods of scheduling. Another tool in developing a schedule is the resource optimization technique. Under resource optimization techniques, we consider two techniques. One is resource leveling. Resource leveling is all about how to balance out constrained resources. Say for an example, you're doing a software development project and then you have only one database administrator who needs to perform many activities. In such a way, the database administrator resource is a critical resource and also it's a scarce resource. It's a constrained resource. In such event, we use the technique of resource leveling to balance out and to ensure that the critical resource is not overstrained. So, in summary, resource leveling is performed when key resource or shared resource are only available at certain times and available in limited quantities, and to keep the resources, such resources usage as a constant level. The resource smoothing is another technique where we use to adjust activities using the float of the path in a situation where there's a requirement that there's a maximum number of resources that can be used in a project. If there's a requirement that your project cannot exceed a certain number of resources, then we need to perform a resource smoothing technique in order to adjust the activities using the float. Let's take an example to understand this. Let's take the following example. In the following example, what I want to discuss shows 6 activities, and each box in the Gantt chart represents 1 month on the horizontal axis. The constraints for the project will be the project cannot have more than 5 resources at any given point. Project cannot have more than 5 resources at any given point, and only 4 resources are available to do activity D. Only 4 resources are available to do activity D. So there are some scarce resources in activity D. So each box represents 1 man month. So there are 2 resources here, 2 man months, 3 man months, and 3 man months. In activity D, there are only 4 resources available, and we start with 3 man months, 3, then we need 5 resources here for 5 man months, 6 resources here for this month for a 6 man month, and a 6 resources here during this month for a 6 man month. Altogether there is 6, 8, 18 and 23 man month worth of activity. So if you take the resource limit, there was a constraint saying at any given point the project should not exceed 5 persons. Here, since there are 3 man months and 4 man months, and that means 7 resources are used. Here again there are 6 resources are used, 8 resources are used, and 6 resources are used. Usually in this, we first perform the resource leveling and then perform resource smoothing. So let's perform resource leveling. Under resource leveling, for activity D, you have only 4 resources at any given time. So here during this period, we need 5 resources, 6 resources, and 6 resources. So this need to be dropped to 4 resources. Total together is 23 man month period. So under resource leveling, definitely the project end date will shift. So we can start with 3, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, because the 4 is the most kept. The total together is 23 man months, which is equal to this one. Point to note is that the project schedule has shifted backwards because of the resource leveling. Then you can understand, even from the original, there is a float here, floating period here, which is not in the critical path, and there is a floating period here, which signifies that this activity is not in the critical path. Once the resource leveling has been done, now we can do the resource smoothing. Here again, the second constraint, the project cannot have more than 5 resources at any given time. Now, after resource leveling, at this point we are using 7 resources, and at this point we are using 6 resources. So now it can be smoothed out using the float. Using the float, it can be smoothed out so that we are within the resource limit. Here we can smooth it out. Since there is a float, this man month can be pushed to another man month. Hope you got this example. So to sum up, first resource leveling, and secondly resource smoothing. The project is supposed to end on week number 7. Because of resource leveling, it will be pushed backward for week number 9, and resource smoothing will be within the week number 9, where we can smooth out the resources. Let's take another example. In this example, activity A is conducted by Tom, which requires 8 hours, and Sue, which requires 8 hours. Activity B, again, Sue requires 8 hours, and activity C is done by Tom. So in day 1, Tom is supposed to work for 8 hours and Sue is supposed to work for 16 hours. In day 2, Tom is supposed to work for 8 hours. Working 16 hours is too much, and it's a constrained resource. There's a scarce resource issue. There's a resource share issue here. So the technique that we can do is resource leveling. Under resource leveling, you allow the project timeline to get pushed out since there is no other option. So in day 1, we can ask Sue to work 8 hours and finish activity day 1. And in day 2, we can ask Sue to finish activity B, and activity C needs to push back since activity C requires output of B, and it can be conducted in day number 3. So this is resource leveling, where the timelines are pushed back in order to accommodate the scarce resource or overstretching of the scarce resource. To sum up, resource optimization techniques, resource leveling and resource smoothing. Resource leveling aims at balancing resource on demand or the scarce resources. Here it aims to achieve uniform resource utilization. We smooth it out. Resource leveling may alter the critical path. Resource smoothing generally do not change the critical path. It is within the critical path. Usually performed after critical path method, but before resource smoothing. So usually we do the critical path method, and then we do a resource leveling, because in the critical path method, as we discussed, it does not consider the resource leveling. It does consider parallel activities, but after the critical path method, the network diagram is drawn, we can do the resource leveling, and this is usually performed after resource leveling. Deals with critical resources, deals with not critical resources. Critical resources are the primary constraint. Project duration is a primary constraint. So resource smoothing, generally we should not push the project duration. Resource leveling, we push the project duration. Reasons to perform, key resources are only available at certain times or is limited in quantities or over allocated, especially in the examples we discussed earlier. It's about over allocation of resources. And reasons to perform, there's limits on resource usage or uneven resource utilization. Let's take some more examples on resource optimization. Please read this example. Under this example, according to the project schedule, coding work of an IT project spans 2.5 months with a 0.5 month free float. So there is a 3-man month activity. The number of developers required for month 1, month 2 and month 3 are 8, 2 and 5. Since it's a 3-month activity, 1, 2, 3 are 8, 2 and 5 respectively. According to the budget, the project can afford a maximum of 6 developers at any month. So there is 8 developers we use in the first month. Around the project manager requested Manisha, the development lead, to adjust the resource requirements for the coding activity to align with the available budget. Manisha rearranged the activities with the developers required for the month 1, month 2 and month 3 and changed to 6, 4 and 5 respectively. And as a result, the duration of the coding activity was pushed back to 2.75 months. If you can remember, earlier it was a 3-month activity with a 0.5 float time. It is not a critical path activity, and now it's still within the original float. Now the duration is 2.75 months. What do you think? Is this a resource loading, resource smoothing, or resource lowering? So this is a clear example of resource smoothing. Since this is not a critical path activity, it had a float and then it did not push back the project timeline. Hence, it's a matter of resource smoothing. Let's take another example. Richard, a key resource for the project, is assigned 100% for the task A and 50% for task B. So Richard is 150% utilized for that project, which is running parallel, which is impossible to perform. So we need to free Richard because he cannot perform at 150%. So the project needs up. It should be resource leveling because it's a critical resource. Richard is a key resource and allocated 150%, and that is the case for resource leveling. Let's take another example. Jack, who is an only designer in high-tech product development project, is only able to work 50% on the project due to his other engagements. His work is on critical path. After adjusting the project schedule to align with Jack's availability, the project's planned completion date has to be pushed out for 2 months. Such adjustment of project schedule. In such an exam question, you have to understand Jack is a critical resource, is a scarce resource, his work is in the critical path, and once you adjust it, the project duration has pushed back. So project durations push back when you do resource leveling. So this is an example of resource leveling. So hope you got a good idea on resource optimization techniques. Right. So let's wrap up. So there are some other modeling techniques that you as a project manager can use in developing a schedule. One is the what if scenarios, where you can do many different project schedules depending on different scenarios that you can come across. And also you can use simulation statistical methods. One thing we discussed earlier, the 3-point estimation, the PERT technique or the beta distribution is also called, will account for uncertainty. And also you could use techniques like Monte Carlo analysis techniques to develop your project schedule as a simulation technique. We need to understand schedule compression techniques as a tool when developing a schedule. So there are 2 schedule compression techniques that will be discussed. One is project crashing and the other one is fast tracking. So project crashing is all about crashing of the project or fast tracking the project by adding more resources, additional resources, by adding resources. Now, for example, a textbook example will be crashing by using overtime of the users, of the resources. And also you need to understand crashing can be done for activities in the critical path, activities which have already afloat. Crashing or adding more resources and completing it before that agreed timeline will have no effect on the project timeline. So if you are performing a crashing by adding more resources or adding more overtime, then it should be for activities which is in the critical path. Fast tracking is another method of schedule compression. Fast tracking is where we try to perform 2 activities in parallel, which is originally sequence one another, while you try to do 2 activities in parallel so that you can cut short the time. However, you need to understand fast tracking may increase the risk because we do not know the interdependency between the 2 activities, and there can be uncertain risks that can pop up suddenly. And fast tracking only works if activities can be overlapped to short the project. So you need to identify which activities can be overlapped. There can be activities in a project that cannot be overlapped or cannot be done parallelly. So we need to understand activities that can be done parallelly and then fast track it. So in conclusion, crashing is adding more resources and fast tracking is doing things parallelly. If you take this example, it takes for these 3 activities 15 days to complete with 1 resource each. Fast tracking is doing activities in parallel. So one method is using the same amount of resources. You can see whether we can do things parallelly so that the project will end by day number 11 and not at day number 15. However, it will add a high risk because we do not know any unforeseen risk that will occur due to project activities done parallelly. In crashing method, we can actually add more resources, 2 resources more, 2 resources more, and then crash the project and finish it early. So apart from day number 15, we can finish it by day number 10. But since we are adding more resources, it will result in high cost. So the output of schedule developing will be obviously the schedule baseline, which is your project schedule. So it will be the approved version of the schedule model, and any changes to the baseline should be done under change control procedures. You can refer my previous videos for that on integrated change control procedures. The schedule baseline should be accepted and approved by all stakeholders so that it is agreed and upon with every stakeholder that this is the project schedule and this is the project baseline schedule. And during the control and monitoring process, there can be variations and there can be adjustment done and through the change control procedures. So this project schedule can be presented to your team and to your other stakeholders in various ways. So you can use a project management software which will develop you some Gantt charts like this, for example. And also, this is another example of a Gantt chart. And also, another output of developed schedule will be the milestone chart, where it will give you the critical milestones of a project, whether it be quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3 in the periods. These are the milestones that your project team should achieve. Some of the other outputs would be documentation updates. By developing a project schedule, you might be able to update your resource requirements or any other activity attributes, your risk registers. Sometimes there can be sometimes since you're shuffling your activities, sometimes it might result in a change in the scope baseline. So then you should go under the integrated change control process to change the scope baseline, because by this time the scope baseline is fixed, and you should perform an integrated change control process to change the scope baseline. And also this has a direct input to the cost baseline, which will be covered in future videos. Thank you.